Opus Dei, an investigation into the secret society struggling for power within the Roman Catholic Church by Michael Walsh. To its supporters, Opus Dei is a spiritual organisation dedicated to preserving Catholic orthodoxy in the face of modernist assault. To its detractors, this highly secret society is a church within a church, promoting its own ecclesiastical allegiances, preserving an antiquated set of spiritual and penitential practices, including the wearing of instruments of mortification like the Silas, or spiked bracelet. And with some of its members supporting right-wing governments in Central and South America. Michael Walsh, an eminent Catholic scholar and former Jesuit, investigates the hidden world of Opus Dei and describes its beginnings in Spain. In 1928, its association with Franco's regime, the movement of its headquarters to Rome in 1947, and its development into a worldwide organisation. Drawing upon interviews and previously unavailable documents, Walsh creates an intriguing and complex portrait of the movement's charismatic founder, the enigmatic Monsignor Jose Maria Escriva del Prelature. Drawing a large percentage of its membership from the wealthy professional classes, Opus Dei is a relatively small organisation that wields considerable power. In Spain, from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s, Generalissimo Francisco Franco chose a number of government ministers from the ranks of Opus. Opus members do not wear any special kind of dress or badge. Even during church occasions, they are required not to present themselves as a group. A member will admit to belonging, but will not say who else belongs. Opus is not simply a new religious body, writes Walsh. It is a new form of institution within the Roman Catholic Church. In 1982, Pope John Paul II granted the organisation the status of personal prelature, making it unique within the Catholic Church, and for all practical purposes an autonomous entity. Opus members are now eager to have Monsignor Escriva, who died in 1975, declared a saint in order to consolidate their power within the Holy See. Opus Dei is a probing, analytical and balanced examination of this organisation, one that is bound to elicit controversy and debate within the Church and society at large. It's in the jacket of the book. Originally published, The Secret World of Opus Dei, London, Grafton Books, 1989. Includes bibliographical references, pages 213 to 219, and index. Looks like the person has written it twice. In Search of Opus, The Origins of Opus, The Years of Expansion, A Change of Status, The Constitutions of 1982, The Spirit of Opus, Politics and Business, Sectarian Catholicism, The Apotheosis of the Founder. And here is all about Michael J. Walsh, Professor of Religion, as well as an active member of the Asian Studies program. He teaches courses on the cultural history of the study of religion, China's political and socio-religious culture, methods and theories in the study of religion, Buddhism and monastic life, colonialism and religion, violence and religion, and the production of sacred space. His books, Sacred Economies, Buddhist monasticism and territoriality in medieval China, Stating the Sacred Religion, etc., both published by Columbia University Press. His most recent work, written for teaching purposes, is about Buddhist monastic space and so forth. Now let's have a look into this particular book by Michael J. Walsh. And there's the information on the inside jacket we've previously read. Looks like somebody's written something in Spanish. Not too sure exactly what that says, but something like simply probably a project or something on the education and so forth, on education or educating people. Not too sure on that one. Contents page. Acknowledgements by the author. Opus Dei. In search of Opus. It is only some 200 kilometers from Cusco, Peru's second city and former capital of the Incas. To the town of Abancay, yet so bad was the road that the author's journey in a Toyota Land Cruiser took all of 10 hours. Abancay itself is a frontier town deep in the Andes. Soldiers guard the entrances. Its inhabitants prefer to drive Jeep-type vehicles or pickup trucks. If they can afford any vehicle at all, only a handful of the streets are metal roads, most are little more than dirt tracks. The building the author had come to visit was just off one of those tracks. The wall around it was broken by an imposing gateway. Inside the wall there was a swimming pool, an elegant flower beds. 2 fountains were playing and so forth. Goes on about that, giving a description. He was visiting it at the suggestion of Ken Duncan, an aid and development consultant who had heard that the author was interested in the Catholic organisation Opus Dei. Duncan, not himself a Catholic, had been taken aback by the activities of Opus in Peru and wanted to tell his experiences to someone who might draw attention to what he saw as unacceptable behaviour on the part of the Opus clergy. In particular, he had been shocked by a Peruvian orphanage to which he had been invited. He was surprised at its size. The Quechua Indians with their extended families really needed the services of an orphanage. He was even more surprised to discover that some of the children in the institution were not even orphans. The church authorities had simply said that their fathers and mothers had not been thought suitable parents, and the children had been taken from them. What happens when the children grow up? Queried Duncan, noticing that few of the orphans were more than 5 or 6 years old. We have friends in America or Germany who take them off of our hands, he was told. People are not charged, he was told, but do make a donation. It seemed remarkably like selling babies. When the author journeyed into Peru in search of Opus, the town had been closed to visitors because of the activities of the far-left terrorist group, the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, for it was related to the author in London and was unable the Shining Path. For that reason he could not himself test the accuracy of the story as it was related to him in London and was unable to see for himself the degree of Opus involvement. The organisation had many levels of commitment and not all of those were Opus Dei members. Not all of those where Opus Dei members are involved can properly be regarded as Opus Dei undertakings. Despite its isolation, the author was able to make his way to Abancay and call it the seminary, the luxury of which, when compared with the bitter poverty of the people outside its walls, Duncan had also found scandalous. The seminary, run by a handful of Opus Dei clergy from Spain in well-cut soutanes, the long black gowns which was once the everyday wear of Catholic priests in Europe, was just as Duncan had described it. Like him, the author was startled by the contrast between the poverty and squalor outside the walls and the comfort within, and by the incongruity of finding such an institution in the depths of the Andes. Ken Duncan had often worked with Catholic organisations. He had high praise for many of them. He was, however, alarmed at the growing influence of Opus in Peru. He was even more alarmed when the author told him of the size and complexity of Opus around the world, at least 3 times the size of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which has hitherto been considered the Roman Catholic Church's most influential religious order. The author's own interest in Opus had first been aroused by an apologia for it, which had appeared at the end of May 1971 in the colour supplement of the Sunday Times. The paper had, apparently, published a hostile piece on the organisation, which had demanded and received the right to reply. The author's attention was drawn to the pro-Opus article by Peter Hebblethwaite, then still as he was a member of the Society of Jesus and editor of the month, the Jesuits' Journal, published from the Society's British headquarters in London, Mayfair. He wrote occasionally for Hebblethwaite, and he suggested he investigate the organisation. He had known little of Opus Dei before he started to research his piece. Its name gave little away. Opus Dei, the work of God, had hitherto been most commonly used within the Roman Catholic Church to describe the prayers which monks sing in common at morning and night. Members of Opus regularly referred to it as the work, which sounded a somewhat provisional title. It has been suggested that its founder, Escriva de Prelature, had at one time thought of calling it the Sociedad de Cooperación Intelectual, or so coined, though nothing came of the idea. In its early years in Spain in the 1930s, it appears to have been little more than a group of Catholic laymen and women who continued in their own jobs, but frequently lived in small communities and were bound together by solemn promises, if not by the formal vows taken by members of religious orders. The chief cement of their Christian fellowship was a form of spiritual guidance provided by the founder, Escriva. This was best encapsulated in a little book of 999 maxims called Camino, the Way. It all seemed fairly harmless. The author swiftly learned, however, that its alleged political role in Franco's Spain, its secrecy, its apparent success, its methods of operation, had all aroused great interest and considerable hostility, both from within the Roman Catholic Church and outside it. The Economist referred to it fairly often in the 1960s and 1970s and insisted on calling its members Opus Deistas, as if they constituted a political party, something they bitterly resented. Even the Times literary supplement, a sober journal hardly given to polemics on church affairs, had carried a hostile article on one of its centre pages in April 1971 under the title The Power of the Party, Opus Dei in Spain. The author's interest was caught partly because he was a Hispanophile, and Spain was clearly the country which had the greatest concentration of members of Opus and where its influence was greatest, and partly because the author was at that time a Jesuit, and Opus was frequently being comparing itself to the Society of Jesus. Not since the society had been founded by Ignatius Loyola in the mid-16th century had a religious organisation within the Roman Catholic Church aroused such controversy, or risen so swiftly, so it appeared, to influence in both church and state. And Opus had, consciously it seemed at the time, copied the society and the work it was trying to do within the church, in particular the education of the Roman Catholic elite. This time, however, the elite was not distinguished by birth, but more in keeping with the spirit of the 20th century, perhaps selected mainly by wealth gained through commerce. When his first article, the author's first article about Opus Dei was published in the month in August 1971, he called it being fair to Opus Dei. He felt it was fair because for the most part he had avoided what had been said about them by their detractors and limited himself to Opus's own productions, particularly the 1950 Constitution and 999 maxims of Escriva de Prelature as contained in Camino. Not surprisingly, perhaps Opus did not think it fair. A few months after the piece appeared, the author arranged an interview with the Opus spokesman in Madrid. The meeting was to take place in the private flat of some friends. The Opus spokesman arrived just after lunch. He would not have a coffee. He would not sit down. He simply berated the author for the injustice which he believed he had perpetrated against Opus, then stormed out. Reaction in England was rather more subdued. Several people he did not know solicited a visit. He managed to avoid meeting him. Then a gentle antique dealer from Norfolk found his way to his office on the grounds that he was a close friend of a friend of his. He too took him to task, but more in sorrow than in anger. He had, he told him, totally failed to capture the spirit of Opus Dei. He was not unwilling to be corrected on points where the author had gone astray. He mentioned one purely technical matter which was not of great importance. The author asked him about the spirituality. Had he got it right? He told him he had not. So he asked for examples. The author asked for examples. He was lost, and the author suspected that the conversation was not going according to his brief. So he tried to help him. He had worked from documents, he remarked, and he was aware that they could be misleading. One had only to think of an examination syllabus, which, in the abstract, always looks so daunting but can usually be reduced to a reasonable size. Opus Dei's spiritual syllabus looked daunting, but, the author said, he suspected that living with it was a good deal easier than it first appeared. He eagerly agreed with the analogy. But when the author asked him to give some examples of where the syllabus and the practice diverged, he was again at a loss. The author tried to help him out of his embarrassed silence. For instance, he said, the Constitution states that you must all sprinkle your beds with holy water before you lie down to sleep at night. And you're sure you don't do that? Again the embarrassment. Yes, we do, he replied. After all, chastity is a very difficult virtue. More than a decade later, a former member of the organisation, Dr. John Walsh of Linacre College, Oxford, told him that being fair to Opus Dei was the first thing he had read without previously asking permission since he had joined. It struck him, he said, as being as close to the spirit of Opus as it was possible to be without having been a member. In the early 1970s, little seems to have been available in English about the organisation and aims of Opus. Hence, the author's article found its way into libraries of cuttings. When an Opus story broke, he was rung up by newspapers, television producers, radio researchers, and the author therefore was able to keep in touch with events concerning the institution. When he began, years later, to do the research for this book, he quickly discovered that some distinguished Roman Catholics thought that Opus Dei was one of the major issues within the Catholic Church at that time. Jose Comblain, a well-known Belgian priest who had spent most of his working life in Latin America, wrote to him from Brazil to say exactly that. In the cloisters of St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on a wet April evening in 1986, the Swiss-born theologian Hans Küng talked to him at length and gave him a string of names of people to contact. And then he heard from a friend in Australia of the extraordinary events surrounding the publication of two pieces about Opus in the daily newspaper, The Australian. He told him stories of computer codes being broken in Opus, knowing about the articles even before the supposedly secret articles had appeared. Rather more sadly, in November 1987, Pedro Miguel Lamet was sacked from his post as editor of the Spanish religious weekly Vida Nueva, or New Life. Under the editorship of Pedro, an old friend of the authors from his Jesuit days, this journal had become possibly the best of its kind in Europe, if not the world. As well as citing the hostility to Vida Nueva of the papal nuncio, the Pope's ambassador in Madrid, Pedro blamed the antagonism and the power of Opus for its dismissal by the company which owned the paper. Lamet's fate is indicative of the power which Opus wields in the higher echelons of the Church. There is an increasing number of Opus bishops, though the percentage of the overall figure, well over 2,000 worldwide, is quite small. There are perhaps less than a dozen. More important is the influence they have in the papal curia, the Pope's Rome-based civil service. Vaticanologists, that small group of journalists who understand the convoluted Inner workings of the Curia. Note with care the rise and fall, usually the rise of ecclesiastical bureaucrats who, with their traditionally conservative outlook, are friendly toward Opus. They note too the more direct influence of the organisation through its members' service as consultors to congregations. Vatican speak for advisors, the papal ministries, such as that for the causes of saints, they are very eager to have their founder declared a saint, or the congregation of bishops. Pope John Paul II also seemed to be in sympathy with Opus, and in 1982 granted the organisation a new legal status which made it unique within the Roman Catholic Church and for all practical purposes an autonomous entity. And so forth. Goes into more detail on it. And gets to where he says, Opus, it seemed at first sight, was different. Religious life, whatever that may mean, has hitherto been limited to those prepared to take the vows, single people prepared to opt for celibacy for the rest of their lives. So the catchment area, as it were, had broadened from those who spent their years, though the catchment area, as it were, had broadened from those who spent their years to as hermits in the desert, to those who lived in townhouses and identified closely with ordinary people. Members of such groups or religious orders were very far from being themselves ordinary people. The author understood it to be the special mark or charism of Opus that it provided a form of religious life in a broad sense for a much wider variety of persons, whether married or single. In other words, the author took it to be a natural extension of the development of religious life within the Church, the Roman Catholic Church. He was soon disillusioned. Unlike many of the great religious orders within the Roman Catholic Church, it has become increasingly priest-dominated, narrow in outlook, and ultra-conservative. And goes on about Vladimir Fausman, an Englishman of Czech origin who joined Opus in 1959, ordained a priest. Opus is not simply a new religious body, it is a new form of institution within the Roman Catholic Church, as the long search for an appropriate juridical status amply demonstrates. In order to be recognised as a legitimate institution, one which has the full approval of the Holy See and of the Church at large, it not only needs the formal approval of its legal position within the Church, it also requires recognition that the founder was a holy man on a par with the great saints such as Francis, Dominic, or Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus. All this is no doubt very laudable, but it makes for complications when trying to present a straightforward account of the life of Escriva. Opus is in control of information about him. The books that it authorises are quite naturally hagiographic in intent. The two most important are Salvador Bernal's Monsignor Jose Maria Escriva de Prelature, profile of the founder of Opus Dei, published in London and New York by Scepter in 1977, just a year after they first appeared in Spanish, and more recently a life by a former Spanish information attaché in London, Andrés Vázquez de Prada, el fundador del Opus Dei. This was produced in Madrid by Ediciones Rialp in 1983, and so forth. To take an example from Vázquez de Prada's book, early on he recalls talking to Escriva de Prelature during one of the latter's visits to London. Vázquez de Prada was about to write a biography of the English statesman and now saint Thomas More. He asked Escriva's advice. You will have to enter into his personality, he was told, or perhaps more accurately, if somewhat freer, you will have to get under his skin. Now, that this excellent advice is hardly original. However, the author's criticism is not of the banality of the advice, but of what Vázquez then does with it. It becomes the opening sentence of this text. He treats it almost as if it were a remarkable revelation. Vasquez then continues with his opening chapter, of which he is clearly proud. He read it. Vladimir Faustman recalls to an expectant gathering of members of Opus in London. The chapter is a meditation upon the day on which Opus Dei was born, 2nd October 1928. It was the day, he reveals, that Louis von Pasteur, the great historian of the modern papacy, died in Paris. It was the 81st birthday of von Hindenburg, President of Germany, and the day that martial law was declared in Albania. It is a little difficult to account for this extraordinary performance, dragged out as it is at some length. Vasquez has even discovered what was showing at the cinemas in Madrid, unless it is to situate the event as if at some providential turning point in the history of the world. And he carries on with that. Goes down to someone called Jose Maria. He was no strong child. When he was only 2 years old, he felt seriously ill. His life was despaired of. His mother Dolores took him to the small shrine of the Virgin Mary at Torre Cuidad, a local place of pilgrimage housing a statue of Mary, possibly dating from the 11th century. Her prayers were answered and Jose recovered. Torre Cuidad has since become yet another monument to the founder. Although the son was thus miraculously restored to health, unhappily for the family, the three Marias all died in a period of just over 3 years, between 1910 and 1913. Jose seems to have believed that he would be the next. He withdrew from the company of his friends and went into a massive depression from which he only slowly emerged, partly at least, it would seem, because of growing confidence that God had him under his particular care. It was at this time Dolores relayed to him the story of the cure at Torre Cuidad, and so forth. And goes into the history of this Jose character. And others. Okay, then he eventually Escriva de Balaguer comes onto the scene. He ministers to the sick, brings them the sacraments, and helping them to resolve personal problems. The work took him from the centre of the Spanish capital into what were then its most distant suburbs. On Sundays he said Mass at the church attached to the Order's central residence. This work with the Apostolic Ladies lasted until July 1931. It was during his time with them that he took the decision to found Opus Dei. From that date, his own life was wholly intertwined with the organisation he had created. And the origins of Opus. One of the odd things about Opus Dei is its lack of history. It has been going for 60 years, and one might have expected some member somewhere to have set down an account of its development, how it grew and expanded, who went when, what were the problems and how they were overcome, what tensions existed and how they were resolved, how the various apostolic works came to be undertaken, how policy was decided, and so on. The obvious setting for such a treatment would have been the volume published in 1982 by the University of Navarra to commemorate somewhat belatedly the Golden Jubilee of Opus Dei's foundation in 1928. There is indeed a section promisingly entitled Opus Dei 50 Years On, but it consists only of two pieces, a hitherto unpublished text of Escrivas and an uninformative, at least as far as the history of the organisation is concerned, interviewed with the new man in charge, Monsignor del Portillo. Note that some of the history cannot be unearthed from the many apologias for Opus, which its supporters have produced over the years, but no directly historical study is mentioned in the bibliographical essay of Lucas F. Mateo Seco, written for the Jubilee volume. What is most remarkable about this bibliography is the paucity of serious works on any aspect of Opus, except that of its recently acquired juridical status as a personal prelature. Nevertheless, of one particular event there is no shortage of accounts: the day and the number of Escriva's decision to found what eventually became Opus Dei. One of the devout members says it was like a divine seed falling from heaven. The idea came to Escriva as he was making a retreat at a house in the outskirts of Madrid belonging to the Vincentians, a Catholic religious order. Escriva was praying, and Bernal claims he saw Opus Dei. At the same time, he heard the bells ringing out from the nearby Church of Our Lady of the Angels to celebrate the patronal feast. 2nd October is the day Roman Catholics commemorate the feast of the guardian angels. What happened exactly, on the other hand, is not entirely clear. Some members of Opus seem to believe that Escriva del Balaguer had a vision of God, but he himself does not claim as much. In fact, he claims very little. It is obvious enough that as a young and ambitious priest in a country which then had far too many clergymen, he was looking for some particular role in life, and there is nothing wrong in that. It seems from the various accounts of the Foundation that during his meditations he began to get an inkling about what his role in life might be. It was later, though not much later, that the notion became clearer and he could take steps to put it into operation. That was all that happened. But with Opus's proclivity for going to extremes, a plaque has been set up in the facade of the new belfry of Our Lady of the Angels, and one of the old bells has been taken to Torre Cuidad as a memento of the founder, and so forth. It's got lots more information on that. Trying to get to the so said history of them grooming younger women, etc. As seen on a documentary in Spanish with English subtitles on Goku. It might even feature on YouTube about Opus Dei, why I escaped Opus Dei, some title like that. Several women speak out against it. It'll probably be better to actually watch that than go through all this information. But that's basically a little bit of information about that particular organisation by Michael J. Walsh. If you found this article interesting and you want to know more, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and then share this video with your family, friends and others. And don't forget to click on the link we'll provide in the description box of the documentary that you can watch, which will make it easier for you to understand this particular Roman Catholic based organisation and the trickery, deceit, etc. that they bestowed upon their followers and so forth. May this video be a blessing to all those within the Roman Catholic Church, etc., that they'll wake up, they'll be enlightened to what is going on within their church and its extended organisations.